It was one of those sterile conference rooms that smelled faintly of printer ink and burnt coffee. The kind you find on the top floors of glass towers in downtown Chicago. I sat near the end of the long mahogany table, the chair a little too modern and a little too cold for comfort. The morning light poured through the windows, bouncing off the steel buildings across the street. And for a second, I caught my reflection in the glass. 68 years old. Silver hair pulled back neatly. Pearl earrings that used to belong to my mother. I looked like what I was supposed to be. A retired businesswoman, here to observe, to nod politely, to let the new generation take charge. The meeting had already dragged on for an hour. PowerPoint slides flashed across the screen. And my daughter, Maggie, stood at the head of the table like she was born to be there. 40 years old. Polished. Confident. Her hair perfectly styled. Her voice smooth like she practiced in front of a mirror. She was presenting quarterly numbers for Hartman Interiors, the design company that had grown out of the real estate business her father and I built decades ago. She glanced over at me only once. A quick flicker of irritation before turning back to the room. Around her sat a sea of young managers, investors, and analysts tapping on their tablets. My sons, David and Sarah, were there too, both trying hard to look important, like extras in a movie about success. When Maggie wrapped up the report, she asked if there were any questions. Her tone made it clear she didn't expect any. I raised my hand anyway. The room shifted a little. Some people straightened in their seats. I could feel the tension before I even spoke. Maggie, I said gently, keeping my voice calm. I was reviewing the lease reports for this building last week. It looks like the rent adjustment hasn't been logged since the last renewal. Do you know if accounting has corrected that? Her jaw tightened. She turned to face me fully for the first time that morning. Mom, we're in the middle of a financial review, not a property management meeting. I understand, I said, smiling lightly. But it's still a major expense for the company. It might be worth noting before you send the final numbers to investors. There was a pause. I could see Mark, her husband, shifting uncomfortably next to her. Someone coughed. Then Maggie laughed. Not the warm kind of laugh, but the sharp, performative kind meant for an audience. Mom, stop acting like you own everything. It's embarrassing. The words hit harder than I expected. They didn't just sting, they cracked something inside me. It wasn't the insult itself. It was the way she said it, with the same dismissive tone she used on junior employees. The kind of tone that said, "You don't matter anymore." A few people chuckled nervously. David looked down, pretending to check his phone. Sarah bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable. I took a slow breath. The air felt heavy in my chest. Then I smiled. The same patient smile I'd used on unruly students back when I taught part-time accounting in my 20s. I leaned back slightly, picked up my phone, and typed a short message to Linda Cooper, my attorney of 20 years. Activate termination clause for lease 520 West Adams. Effective tomorrow morning. I pressed send and set the phone face down on the table. The room continued. Oblivious. Maggie clicked to the next slide. Her voice smooth again, as if nothing had happened. As you can see, our profit margins remain stable despite the recent renovation costs. I watched her. Really watched her. The tilt of her chin. The way she used her father's phrases without realizing it. Robert used to say profit margins remain stable right before he'd admit a project had gone over budget. I almost laughed. The meeting rolled on. People nodded, murmured their agreements, took notes. But I wasn't listening anymore. My pulse had steadied. And beneath the calm was something colder. Steadier. Like the surface of a frozen lake right before it cracks. I thought about the years we'd spent building the Morgan and Hartman Group from scratch. Robert and I had mortgaged our first home to buy that old warehouse on Monroe Street. I remembered painting the office walls myself, answering phones late at night while Robert negotiated deals in the next room. We didn't inherit power, we built it brick by brick. And now, our children thought they were the ones who created everything. That I was just the sentimental old woman sitting in the corner with no voice left. Maggie's voice cut back into my thoughts. So, moving on to projections for the next quarter, I tuned her out. My mind was already moving ahead to the email Linda would send tonight, confirming the activation of the clause. To the property management team, updating the access system. To the security staff briefed for the morning. The beauty of being the primary landlord was that everything moved with one signature. Mine. When the meeting finally adjourned, everyone stood and shuffled toward the door, chattering about lunch reservations and investor calls. Maggie brushed past me without meeting my eyes. "We'll catch up later, Mom," she said briskly. Already halfway down the hallway. "Of course, dear," I replied softly. Mark stopped just long enough to murmur, "She didn't mean it. You know, it's just stress." I smiled at him. That same polite smile again. Stress reveals character. "Mark, tell her I said thank you for the reminder." He blinked, confused, then followed her out. When the door closed behind them, I sat there alone for a long moment. The city hummed outside, cars and voices echoing off the glass. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. No tremor at all. I hadn't felt that kind of clarity in years. They thought I was done. That I'd handed over my life's work and faded into the background like an old photograph collecting dust. They forgot that I'd spent decades learning how power really worked. Power wasn't in titles or quarterly reports. It was in contracts, signatures, and knowing exactly when to pull a thread. I gathered my things slowly, tucked my phone into my purse, and walked out into the bright hallway. The receptionist smiled at me as I passed. "Have a good day, Mrs. Morgan." "Oh, I intend to," I said, and meant every word. Outside, the wind off Lake Michigan cut through my coat, sharp and cold. But it felt clean somehow, like fresh air after a storm. Tomorrow morning, they'd realize the air wasn't so thin without me. They'd finally see what happened when the person they underestimated decided she'd had enough. I buttoned my coat, adjusted my scarf, and started walking toward the elevator. My reflection followed me in the glass wall beside the lobby. Steady and familiar, I caught myself whispering. Almost to Robert. Almost to no one. They wanted to see who really owns everything. Let's show them. The elevator chimed open, and I stepped inside, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss, sealing the quiet. The elevator hummed softly as it carried me down to the lobby. By the time the doors slid open, I had already drifted somewhere far from the cold glass building behind me. The memories came uninvited, like a slow film reel unspooling in my head. Back then, Chicago wasn't glittering with tech startups and rooftop lounges. It was raw, gray, and hungry. Robert and I had started Morgan and Hartman Holdings in 1998, when we were both young enough to believe that hard work could bend the world into shape. We bought a crumbling warehouse on Monroe Street for a price that made our parents call us reckless. We painted the walls ourselves on weekends, filled the office with mismatched furniture we found at estate sales, and celebrated our first client with takeout pizza on the floor because we couldn't afford chairs yet. Robert was the dreamer. I was the one who made sure dreams paid the bills. He had a gift for seeing possibilities, while I had the numbers in my head like a compass. We were a perfect match. There were nights when we'd fall asleep at our desks, his head on one pile of contracts, mine on another, and wake up laughing when the cleaning crew found us. When the business finally took off in the early 2000s, we built it carefully, brick by brick. We learned every inch of the city, every zoning code, every loophole that could make or break a deal. By the time our kids were in high school, we owned 3 commercial buildings and had tenants with names that appeared in newspapers. We never thought of ourselves as rich. We were just tired people who'd earned the right to stop worrying about groceries. I remember the day we bought the property on West Adams. It wasn't fancy then. Just another aging office tower from the 70s, with brown carpet and flickering lights. Robert looked up at it and said, "This one has bones." I said, "It has plumbing issues." We bought it anyway. It became the jewel of our portfolio. The building that would later house our children's company. We always thought we were building something for them. Maggie showed the sharpest interest. She was only 12 when she started reading floor plans over Robert's shoulder. David preferred the numbers. The game of growth. Sarah was the creative one. Always sketching logos and designing pretend brochures. We used to joke that the 3 of them together made a perfect replacement for us someday. When Robert passed in 2018, the heir left the house. He'd been sick for months. But I didn't realize how deeply the silence would settle once he was gone. For weeks, I'd walk into his office, expecting to find him there. Hands folded. Coffee cup, half empty. The company kept running. But it felt mechanical. Without him. Even success seemed hollow. It was Maggie who insisted I take a step back. She said it kindly the first time. "Mom, you've done enough. Let us handle it now." I wanted to believe her. I thought, maybe this is what good parents do. They hand over what they built and trust their children to protect it. So I signed the documents. One after another. Transferring daily control to the kids. Keeping only the ownership rights Robert had insisted on. He was very specific about that before he died. Keep the building. Ellie. Keep a seat at the table. They'll need your name more than they know. For a while, things looked fine. Maggie was efficient. Polished. Good with people. Investors liked her. David was competent. If a little impulsive. Sarah took over marketing and filled the company's social media with glowing posts about the family legacy. I watched from a distance. Proud. Though something in me stayed uneasy. It's funny how you can feel a house cracking long before you hear the first beam snap. The first small shift came a year after Robert's death. Maggie suggested streamlining operations, which meant pushing me off the board and renaming the firm Hartman Interiors. Leaving out Morgan entirely. She called it a branding decision. I called it what it was: erasure. When I asked about it, she smiled, that same polite smile she used on clients. "Mom, it's just cleaner. People like single names. It doesn't mean anything." But it did. It meant she wanted distance. After that, the invitations to board meetings stopped coming. Updates were summaries sent through assistants. When I asked for the quarterly reports, Maggie told me not to worry about all that stress. That's when I started keeping copies of everything that still crossed my desk: leases, legal renewals, tax statements. I didn't say anything to the kids. I tried to keep the peace. We still had Sunday dinners at my place in the suburbs, though even those began to feel performative. Maggie arrived late. Always on the phone. David boasted about new partnerships I'd never approved. Sarah scrolled through her phone between bites, nodding at stories she wasn't really hearing. They smiled. Said they loved me. Called me Mom like it was punctuation. And left early to get back to their real lives. I think the breaking point came 2 summers ago. At the dedication ceremony for the company's new design studio. Maggie gave a speech in front of a crowd of investors and journalists. Thanking her husband Mark. Thanking the employees. Thanking her late father for his entrepreneurial spirit. She never mentioned me once. I stood there, holding the program in my hands, feeling invisible. Like a ghost hovering over something I had built but no longer belonged to. That night, Linda came over for wine. She had known Robert and me for decades. Had drawn up every contract we ever signed. I told her I didn't understand how everything had shifted so completely. She looked at me with that steady lawyer's expression of hers. You didn't lose it, Ellie. You gave it away. But you didn't give away ownership. Remember that. She was right. The deeds were still mine. The lease for the West Adams building was still under my name. I'd left it that way because it made sense at the time. A precaution. I'd never thought I'd have to use it. As I sat there on the couch, the city lights flickering through the window, I could almost hear Robert's voice again. He had always been the calm one. Don't get angry, Ellie. Just get smart. Maybe that's what this was. Not anger, but clarity. The next morning, I drove into the city early. Before the traffic built up, I parked across from the building and looked up at it. The glass catching the sunrise. I still remembered standing on that same sidewalk with Robert, years ago, watching workers hang our company's first logo on the entrance. My chest tightened a little. Inside the lobby, the security guard recognized me immediately. Morning. Mrs. Morgan. Haven't seen you in a while. I smiled. I've been letting the young ones take over. He laughed. Guess that's what retirement's for. I nodded but said nothing. Retirement. The word tasted foreign. I wasn't retired. I was sidelined. There's a difference. As I rode the elevator up, the mirrored walls reflected my face from every angle. I didn't look angry. I looked awake. I thought about what would happen when Maggie realized what that short text I sent actually meant. How she'd learn that her empire still stood on my foundation. I wondered if she'd understand why I had done it. When the doors opened, the hallway was quiet. Almost too quiet. I walked to the corner office that used to be mine and pressed my hand against the door. My name wasn't on the glass anymore. Just hers. That was fine. They could keep the sign. I still had the keys. The view from the window stretched across the city. The same view Robert used to call his compass. I whispered softly, almost as if he could hear me. You told me to keep the seat. Robert, I never said I'd stay seated forever. Down below, the traffic lights blinked red and green, like tiny signals waiting for someone to decide when to move. I took a deep breath and turned away from the window, knowing that the next move was already in motion. That afternoon the sky turned the color of steel. Heavy and gray. The kind that pressed against the windows and made the whole city feel smaller. I drove back to the house in Evanston with a strange calm in my chest. The kids were all coming for Sunday dinner that night. One of those habits we had tried to keep after Robert passed. Lately, it felt less like a family tradition and more like a performance we all pretended to enjoy. By 6 o'clock, the house smelled like roast chicken and rosemary. I still cooked too much. Always did. Robert used to tease me that I cooked as if we were feeding an army. Maybe part of me still hoped that food could fix what words could not. I set the table, poured myself a glass of red wine, and told myself I'd keep things light. Maggie was the first to arrive. As usual, dressed like she had stepped out of a magazine. Her husband Mark followed, phone in hand. Already distracted, David came next. Tie loosened. The scent of expensive cologne trailing behind him. Sarah drifted in last, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked too thin for the weather. Her eyes glued to her phone. Dinner started with small talk. Maggie bragged about a new client contract. David talked about an investment he was exploring. Sarah showed photos of a weekend trip. I smiled and nodded. But their words skimmed past me like pebbles skipping over water. The rhythm of it felt rehearsed. Halfway through dinner, I decided to ask, "How are things at the office?" I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Maggie didn't look up from her plate. Busy. As always. We're expanding into 2 new markets next quarter. And how's the lease working out at West Adams? I asked, still keeping my voice even. That got her attention. She looked up, her fork pausing midair. Fine. she said after a second. Why do you ask? Just curious. It's a beautiful building. David laughed under his breath. Mom, you really can't stop worrying about the old days. Can you? The old days built the company you work for, I said before I could stop myself. The table went quiet. Mark cleared his throat. Maybe we should just enjoy the meal, he muttered. Maggie's voice was calm, but the edge was there. We're handling things. Mom, you don't have to check up on us. I looked at her. Handling things. That was her phrase lately. The one she used to close any conversation she didn't want to have. I thought about how many times Robert had said, "Listen before you lead." I wondered if she had ever heard him at all. I smiled, trying to soften the moment. I'm not checking up, just interested. Sarah finally looked up from her phone. Mom, maybe it's good for you to relax a little. You've done this for so long. Let us take it from here. There it was again. That gentle dismissal, disguised as care. Let us take it from here. You're right, I said. I guess I just miss being part of it sometimes. David grinned. Then maybe you should start a hobby. Mom, I hear painting is good for stress. Maggie laughed quietly. Or gardening. Something that doesn't involve financial reports. I felt the heat rising in my chest. But I swallowed it down. They weren't being cruel. Not exactly. They were being careless. Careless with the woman who had spent 40 years making sure their world never fell apart. When Robert and I started the company, we used to talk about legacy. We wanted something that would outlast us. Something our children could be proud of. But sitting there at that table, watching them talk over me, I realized they didn't see legacy the way we had. To them, it wasn't roots. It was entitlement. The conversation moved on to vacations, to restaurants, to some new conference Maggie was flying to next week. I stopped listening. I just sat there, letting their voices blur into background noise. After dinner, while they lingered in the living room with coffee, I cleared the dishes. It was a small ritual that always grounded me. Maggie followed me into the kitchen, setting her cup on the counter. You know we love you, Mom, she said. Her tone practiced. But you have to let us run things. It's our turn. I wiped my hands on a towel. I have no intention of stopping you. Maggie, I just hope you remember that respect doesn't have an expiration date. She hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. You're taking this too personally. It's business. Business built on personal sacrifice. I said. Your father and I didn't create this company so you could forget where it came from. She sighed. Annoyed. Mom. No one's forgetting anything. We're just moving forward. That's what progress is. Progress is fine, I said softly. As long as it's not at the expense of gratitude. Her phone buzzed. And she picked it up instantly. I'll call you later, she said. Already halfway out the door, I watched her go. The faint sound of her heels fading down the hallway. David and Sarah were laughing about something in the next room. I finished washing the dishes in silence. When they left later that night, I stood at the front door and waved goodbye. Sarah hugged me quickly. David promised to call. Maggie gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek. The moment the door closed, the house fell into a quiet so deep it felt almost physical. I walked back into the dining room. The table still held traces of dinner, a half-empty wine glass, crumbs, a napkin folded carelessly on a plate. For a second, I could almost see Robert sitting across from me, smiling the way he used to after the kids left, shaking his head and saying, "They'll figure it out someday." Maybe they would. But maybe they needed a little help, remembering what mattered. I went to my office, a small room off the kitchen where I still kept my old files. The shelves were lined with binders, each labeled in my handwriting. Contracts, taxes, leases. I pulled out the one marked West Adams Building and set it on the desk. Inside were the original documents, yellowed at the edges, but still crisp. My name was on every page. The sound of rain started against the windows. Soft at first, then steady. I sat there, listening to it, flipping through the pages one by one, tracing the familiar signatures. Robert's handwriting beside mine looked strong, deliberate. He had always signed with confidence. A man certain of what he built. I felt a pang of nostalgia. Then something steadier beneath it. Resolve. If Maggie wanted to talk about progress, she would have to learn that progress doesn't erase the past. It stands on it. The clock ticked past midnight before I finally closed the binder. I left it on the desk. The document still open to the signature page. Upstairs. The house creaked as the temperature dropped. I turned off the light and stood by the window for a moment, watching the rain blur the streetlights outside. Somewhere in the city, my children were sleeping soundly, sure that tomorrow would look like every day before it. But things had already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. Morning came washed in a pale gray, the kind of light that makes everything feel undecided. I made coffee, the good kind Robert used to buy, and sat at my kitchen desk with the West Adams binder still open to the page where our names sat side by side. My laptop chimed. New mail slid into my inbox with a subject line that was vague enough to ignore and sharp enough to cut through my calm. It said from accounting. Private. There was no name in the sender field. Only a string of letters and numbers that looked like someone had made it in a hurry. I hovered for a second, then opened it. The first line said that the writer worked in finance at Hartman Interiors and had information I needed to see. The next lines came in short bursts, like the person could not decide whether to be brave or afraid. Expense reports had been altered. Vendor accounts had been used to move funds that were not tied to approved projects. Internal transfers were pushed through near quarter end to make margins look better. The message ended with a simple sentence that felt heavier than all the rest. Please do not let them drag your name into this. There were attachments, spreadsheets, PDFs, screen grabs of ledger entries. I clicked through them one by one, heart thudding in a slow, steady beat. Most people think fraud looks like fireworks. In reality, it looks like nicked corners and familiar numbers that are off by a hair. It looks like a date changed. It looks like a vendor paid twice, and then reversed. It looks like smart people who assume no one is watching. I printed the email and the attachments, then called Linda. She picked up on the second ring. Voice steady. Already at her desk downtown. I told her I had received an anonymous message from someone in accounting and that I needed her to review the documents immediately. She said bring them in. And I said I would be there within the hour. Traffic into the loop was easy for once. The lake looked like slate under a sky the color of old pewter. I parked in the underground garage below Linda's building and rode the elevator up. The air in the car smelling like paper and lemons. Her office door was open, and she stood to greet me. Gray suit, calm eyes. The kind of presence that slows your pulse just by standing near it. I laid the stack of papers on her table. She read quickly, lips pressed together, hand moving to underline things with a pencil that had no eraser. After a while, she said that patterns like this did not happen by accident. She asked if anyone else had seen the email. I said no. She asked if I had replied. I said not yet. She told me to forward the entire message to her secure address and to save the hard copies in a folder separate from my other files. Then she pulled a thin binder from her shelf and opened it to the lease for West Adams. She turned to the section she herself had drafted years ago. The ethics clause that allowed termination for misconduct materially affecting the reputation of the property or the landlord. She tapped the paragraph with her pencil and said the words I had been waiting to hear. If this holds, you are within your rights. I felt both relief and a strange grief. I had not wanted this to be true. Not really. I had wanted my kids to be careless, not dishonest. There is a difference. Carelessness can be corrected. Dishonesty has to be cut out. Linda said we should verify the sender before we moved. She suggested a coffee shop 2 streets away that sat in the shadow of an old church. Busy enough to be safe. Quiet enough to talk. She would reach out through a reply that did not reveal my address. And if the person agreed, we would meet within the day. She sent the message while I sat there. And we waited in the kind of silence that feels like the held breath before a verdict. The reply came 15 minutes later. The person agreed to meet at noon and gave a name. Janet Morales. I did not recognize it. Linda nodded and said we would go together. Noon found us at a table by the window. The coffee shop smelling like cinnamon and wet wool. A young woman in a navy cardigan came in. Hair pulled into a low bun. Hands worrying the strap of her bag. She scanned the room and headed toward us with the tentative step of someone who wants to be invisible and cannot be. She introduced herself as Janet and said she worked in payables and reconciliation. Her voice was steady for the first sentence, then thinned when she added that she had been up half the night deciding whether to send the email. She told us that in the last 2 quarters, entries had been pushed through near reporting deadlines. Then unwound the following month. She said the same vendor code appeared on invoices for unrelated departments, and that approvals had jumped chains to get things through without the usual checks. When Linda asked who had signed off, Janet hesitated. She said that some approvals had come from a generic operations account, but that she had seen internal messages where David asked a senior analyst to push a batch through. She also mentioned that Maggie had flagged a project as strategic and fast track, which made expenses harder to challenge. I asked how she found me. She said she remembered when I used to bring lunch to the accounting floor on Fridays. The days when people stayed late to close the month. She said I had always asked her name. It was such a small thing to remember. And yet it undid me more than the numbers. Linda asked if Janet had copies of the original entries. Janet slid a flash drive across the table and said that she had exported the audit logs and that the timestamps would match what she had described. She looked at me then and said that she was not trying to hurt anyone. But she also did not want to be part of something that would hurt a lot more people later. She said that once the auditors looked closely, my name would be on every lease and every legacy document. And she could not watch that get dragged in the mud. I told her she had done the right thing. I told her that whatever happened next, she would not stand alone. She nodded, eyes bright. Then took a long sip of coffee like it might steady her hands. Linda said that from this point forward, Janet should send all communications through her. And that if anyone at the company asked about missing files or questions in payables, she was to refer them to legal and say nothing else. We stood to leave. And Janet gripped my hand for a second. She said her mother used to tell her that doing the right thing rarely feels good at first. I told her that her mother was a wise woman. Back in Linda's office, we laid out the next steps like chess pieces. First, we would authenticate the logs. Then Linda would prepare a notice of default under the lease citing the ethics clause, with copies of the key entries attached and the option to cure, framed around the demand for a forensic review by an independent firm. She reminded me that the clause did not require me to offer a cure, but she recommended it. Not to help them buy time, but to demonstrate that we were not acting out of impulse. We were acting out of duty. She also suggested we notify the board of the parent company that a material issue had arisen affecting a subsidiary's lease and reputation. That would require a special meeting within 10 days. She believed that Frank Lewis, who still held a small but meaningful stake, would side with me. I nodded and said that Frank knew where the bones were buried because he had helped build the body. Before I left, Linda looked at me and asked how I was doing. Not as a lawyer, but as a friend. I told her the truth. I felt like someone had taken a picture of my family and scraped a thumb across it. The shapes were still there, but the faces were smudged. On the drive home, I replayed the morning in my head until the scenes were smooth. The email, Janet's face when she said she could not be part of it, Linda's pencil tapping the clause she had drafted with Robert and me years ago. I drove past the West Adams building and slowed at the curb. The lobby doors turned on their hinges as people drifted in and out, unaware of the current running just beneath their feet. At home, the house was quiet. A winter kind of quiet that sinks into the wood. I warmed leftover chicken and ate standing at the counter. Something I never allow myself to do. Then made tea and went back to my office. The binder was where I had left it. I took out a yellow legal pad and wrote down 3 words in big, even letters. Protect the name. Night pressed up against the windows. I checked my phone and saw a single new message from Linda. She confirmed the logs matched. The entries were real. And the timeline supported termination under the lease. She would send a draft notice for my review before morning. She added one line that made me sit back and stare at the wall. Once we send this, there is no going back. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the heat click through the vents. Somewhere across the city, my children were finishing late emails, scheduling meetings, choosing outfits for tomorrow's projections and pretense. I wondered if Maggie would sleep soundly. I wondered if David would. I wondered when Sarah would stop pretending not to see the cracks. The clock hit 10. I stood, stretched the stiffness out of my back, and closed the binder with a soft thud. The sound seemed to carry through the house. I left the office door half open and climbed the stairs slowly, the way you do when you are trying not to wake anyone. In the bedroom, I pulled the curtains back and watched the street go still. There is a moment before a storm when the air feels heavy and honest. That is what the room felt like. I lay down and put a hand over my ribs, counting the rise and fall until sleep came. Not as comfort, but as a clean white space between one decision and the next. The next morning began with a phone call from Linda. Her voice was brisk but not unkind. The documents were ready, she said, and she wanted me to come into the office to sign the notice of default. I agreed and told her I would be there within the hour. After we hung up, I stood for a moment in my kitchen, the phone still in my hand, staring out at the pale sky over Evanston. I had imagined this moment for months, but it felt heavier than I expected, like the air itself had thickened around me. By the time I parked downtown, the city had shaken off its morning haze. People hurried along the sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, coats pulled tight against the wind. I moved more slowly, each step deliberate. Linda greeted me with her usual calm. Her desk, a spread of organized precision. She handed me the draft notice printed on thick ivory paper. My name embossed at the top. It was direct, professional, and unflinching. The letter stated that the tenant, Hartman Interiors LLC, had breached the lease terms through financial misconduct affecting the landlord's reputation. It demanded an immediate independent audit and full access to all records related to the property's finances. Failure to comply within 30 days would result in termination of the lease and repossession of the premises. My hand hovered over the line where I was meant to sign. Linda watched me. "Once you sign this," she said quietly, "there's no walking it back." I signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. She nodded, took the papers, and said she would have her courier deliver them before noon. I thanked her, but the word felt small in my mouth. On the drive home, I thought about Maggie, about the way she looked at me in meetings, the way she used to look up to me when she was little, when she was 10. She used to sit at my desk and spin in my chair, pretending she was the boss. I used to think it was cute. Now, it felt like I had raised a mirror that no longer reflected me. At home, the answering machine light was blinking. 3 new messages. I pressed play. The first was a reminder from my doctor's office. The second was a telemarketer. The third made me freeze. "Mom. It's Maggie. I just got off the phone with the bank. Something's wrong with the lease payments. The building manager said they received notice from your lawyer. Please call me." Her voice was a mix of confusion and irritation. the tone of someone used to control, slipping away from them. I didn't call back. Not yet. By 5 o'clock. My phone had rung 6 times. Maggie twice. David once. And Mark 3 times. I let them all go to voicemail. When the house phone rang, I turned off the ringer. I wasn't ready for their voices. Not until they had time to sit with the shock. The first confrontation came the next morning. I had just finished making coffee when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw Maggie's car parked crookedly in the driveway. Mark still in the passenger seat. She was standing on the porch, arms crossed, face tight with cold and anger. I opened the door just enough to look at her. "Good morning," I said. "Mom." "What did you do?" she snapped. Stepping closer, I sipped my coffee. "I'm having breakfast. Would you like to come in?" She brushed past me, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "You can't just terminate a lease without warning," she said. "Do you have any idea what this does to us?" I closed the door quietly and turned to her. "I didn't terminate it," I said evenly. "I issued a notice of default. There's a difference." Mark came in behind her, looking uneasy. "Eleanor, maybe we can all just sit down and talk." Maggie spun on him. "No. Mark. This is insane. My own mother trying to shut down my company." I set my coffee cup on the counter. "You're mistaken, dear. I'm not shutting down your company. I'm protecting my property." Her jaw tightened. "From your own family. From anyone misusing it." For a second, she looked genuinely stunned, like she couldn't decide whether to shout or laugh. Then she said, in that cold tone I had once heard her use on subordinates, "I can't believe you'd humiliate me like this." I met her eyes. "You did that yourself, when you signed off on falsified reports." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Mark blinked. "What reports?" Maggie's face went pale. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I tilted my head. "Then you won't mind an independent audit verifying that, will you?" Her voice cracked just slightly. "You can't do this." "I already did." She turned and stormed toward the door, muttering something under her breath. Mark gave me an apologetic look before following her out. The car tires screeched as they pulled away. For a long moment, I stood there in the quiet, the echo of their voices still hanging in the air. Then I went to the sink, rinsed out my coffee cup, and placed it gently in the rack. By evening, my phone was buzzing again. This time, with David's number flashing across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom." "What's going on?" Maggie just called me screaming about eviction notices. I sat down at the kitchen table. "I'm not evicting anyone. I'm enforcing a clause." He sighed, exasperated. "You can't just pull something like this. Do you know how this looks? Investors are calling me. The board's panicking." "Then perhaps the board should have been paying closer attention," I said. He lowered his voice like he was negotiating with a client. "Okay. Look. Whatever this is, we can fix it. Just rescind the notice. I'll get the auditors to smooth everything over." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "You can't fix integrity with a memo." "David." "Mom. Please," he said, frustration bleeding through. "You're overreacting. You don't understand how the business works now. That's where you're wrong." I said softly. "I understand exactly how it works now. That's the problem." There was a pause. Then he said something that would echo in my mind for days. "If Dad were here, he'd never let you do this." I felt that one. The way grief always feels sudden, even when it's years old. I closed my eyes for a second before answering. "If your father were here, this wouldn't have been necessary." He said nothing. I heard him exhale, a sound that carried both anger and something close to shame. Then the line went dead. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the quiet house. The late afternoon light slanted across the floorboards. golden and cold. I could almost hear Robert again. His voice calm and certain. Don't get angry. Ellie. Get smart. That night, Linda called to say that the notice had been received and acknowledged by the tenant's legal team. They had 30 days to respond. But given the situation, she expected a reaction much sooner. I told her I was ready. After we hung up, I poured myself a small glass of wine and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was sharp, smelling of rain and wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn blew. I thought about my children, about the lines that had been crossed long before this day. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was recognition. The acknowledgement that what I built still mattered. That I still mattered. The porch light flickered, and for a moment, the yard fell into darkness before the bulb steadied again. I watched the shadows shift across the grass. The quiet hum of the city far away. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. Some truths only bloom in silence. And tonight, the silence felt almost holy. The next few days felt like walking through a quiet storm. Nothing looked different from the outside. The mail still came. The neighbors still waved when they saw me in the yard. But beneath it all, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way the phone rang earlier each morning, in the tone of the voicemails that piled up on the machine, the calm before the collapse. By Wednesday, the first official response arrived. Linda called as I was finishing breakfast. Her tone was clipped but steady. Hartman Interiors had hired their own counsel, a mid-tier firm in the city, known for being loud before they were effective. They were contesting the notice, claiming the accusations were unfounded and the lease termination unlawful. She said she expected a follow-up letter within 24 hours. I told her to let them send whatever they pleased. I wasn't backing down. That afternoon, the quiet finally broke. Maggie showed up again. This time, with David and Sarah in tow. They didn't call ahead. They just pulled into my driveway like a small parade of indignation. I watched from the living room window as they stood outside their cars, whispering, gesturing toward the house. When I opened the door, their faces looked like a single emotion stretched across 3 people, disbelief turning into anger. Maggie started first. As always, "Mom, we need to talk." I nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." They filed into the living room, standing instead of sitting, as if afraid that sitting down would make this conversation real. David crossed his arms. Sarah clutched her phone like it was a lifeline. Maggie spoke again. "We got a letter from your lawyer. What on earth are you doing?" I sat in my favorite chair, the one Robert used to claim during football games, and looked at them calmly. "Protecting my interests," I said. Maggie scoffed. "Your interests? We're your family. Family doesn't falsify financial reports," I said. Sarah's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" I looked at her. About the audit logs. About money being shifted through fake vendor accounts. About the company using the building's assets in ways that violate the lease. Maggie's face went red. "Who told you that?" "Someone who still remembers integrity," I said. David stepped forward. "Mom, you're acting like you don't trust us. Trust is earned, not inherited," I said softly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah blurted out, "You could ruin everything." I met her eyes. "I'm not ruining anything. I'm uncovering what's already broken." Maggie exhaled hard, pacing. "This isn't just business. Mom, you're hurting people, employees, families. Do you even realize what happens if this gets out?" I stood, slow but steady. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before it came to this." David shook his head. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. This isn't how things work anymore. The company's bigger. The deals are more complex. We had to move fast." I stared at him. Moving fast doesn't excuse moving dishonestly. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The silence stretched until Maggie's voice cut through it. Colder now. So this is it. You're choosing a building over your children. I smiled faintly. No. Maggie. I'm choosing integrity over silence. Sarah started crying. David muttered something under his breath. Maggie turned to her siblings. Let's go. We're done here. As they left, I said quietly, you'll have 30 days to decide whether you want to make this right or make it worse. The door closed behind them, harder than necessary, the sound echoing through the house long after their footsteps faded. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, and the cool autumn air pressing against my face. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel what I'd been holding back. Sadness. Sharp and familiar. Not just for what they had done, but for the way they looked at me now. As if I were the enemy. When you raise children, you spend years protecting them from the world. You never expect that one day you'll have to protect the world from them. The next morning, I woke to find 3 missed calls and 1 new voicemail. This one wasn't from my children. It was from Janet Morales. Her voice was shaking. Mrs. Morgan. They know someone leaked the reports. HR's asking questions. I think they're trying to trace it back to me. Please call me. I called Linda first. She told me to stay calm and that she'd reach out to Janet immediately, reminding her of her legal protections as a whistleblower. I trusted Linda, but I couldn't shake the image of that young woman sitting in the coffee shop, hands trembling around her cup. She had done the right thing, and now she might pay for it. By noon, Linda called back. Janet's safe, she said. She's working from home under counsel's advice. HR knows not to push her right now. They're nervous. That's good. I asked if the company had responded formally yet. Linda said their lawyers had sent a letter full of bluster and no substance. They wanted a meeting to resolve the matter privately. I laughed. They could have called it what it was, a plea to stop before the board found out. Linda advised I agree to the meeting, but only with counsel present. She would handle the logistics. I said fine. And she scheduled it for Friday morning at their downtown office. The rest of the week felt heavy and strange. I avoided the news. Avoided calls from anyone who might ask questions. I spent the evenings going through old photo albums instead. Pictures of the kids at the beach. Birthdays. Graduations. Robert holding Maggie's hand on her first day of work. Sarah in her prom dress. David standing next to his father, proud and nervous in a suit too big for him. Looking at those faces, I wanted to believe they were still in there somewhere, buried under years of ambition and pride. Friday arrived cold and clear. I wore a navy suit I hadn't taken out of the closet since Robert's funeral. It still fit. In the mirror, I looked like the woman I used to be, composed, decisive, ready. When I arrived at the law office, Maggie and David were already there with their counsel. Sarah wasn't. She had never liked confrontation. Mark sat quietly beside Maggie, his face tight. Linda took a seat next to me, her presence like a steel wall at my back. The opposing lawyer started talking first, reading from a prepared statement about family disputes and emotional distress. I let him finish, then looked straight at my children. You know why we're here, I said. You misused the building's accounts. You falsified records. You put the company and my name at risk. Maggie clenched her fists. That's not true. Linda slid a folder across the table. The audit logs, the wire transfers, the vendor lists. Everything Janet had risked her job to bring forward. David's face drained of color. Maggie stared at the papers without touching them. I leaned forward slightly. You have 30 days to respond. Just like the letter says. After that, I terminate the lease and report the findings to the board and authorities. The room went still. For a moment, I thought Maggie might cry, but she didn't. She just looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. "You're really doing this?" she whispered. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm doing what your father would have done." When the meeting ended, they walked out first. Linda gathered the papers, her movements calm and methodical. I stood by the window for a while, watching the traffic crawl below. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the slow ache of something necessary but irreversible. Outside, the wind cut through the buildings, carrying the faint smell of rain. I buttoned my coat and walked into it, each step steady, each breath deliberate. Somewhere behind me, my children were unraveling the first threads of the web they had spun, and I was finally done pretending not to see. The next week crawled by in fragments of silence and small interruptions. A courier delivered more paperwork from Linda, a stack of formal correspondence from the other firm, each letter colder and more desperate than the last. I didn't bother reading them line by line anymore. Linda handled that. My job now was to wait. And I had never been good at waiting. Every morning, I went through the same routine: coffee, quiet walk to the mailbox, a glance at the sky. I told myself the rhythm helped, though sometimes it felt like I was moving through a play whose ending everyone already knew. I thought I would feel stronger by now, vindicated even for hence. But instead, I felt something more complicated. Power comes with a price. And sometimes, that price is loneliness. By Wednesday afternoon, the silence finally cracked. The doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Sarah stood there, her eyes red, her posture deflated. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her hair looked like she had been running her hands through it for hours. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. I stepped aside without a word and let her in. She followed me into the kitchen, where the smell of coffee still hung in the air. She didn't sit right away, just stood by the counter like she was afraid to. I poured her a cup and pushed it toward her. She took it with both hands, staring down at the steam. "You talked to your sister," I said. She nodded. "Maggie's furious. David's pretending everything's fine. But Mom, you have to understand how bad this is getting. Investors are calling. People are talking." I sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap. "People should talk. Maybe they'll remember that accountability still exists." She looked up at me, eyes wide. "Maggie says you're doing this to punish us." I smiled. A tired, sort of smile. "Do you believe that?" She hesitated. "I think you're hurt," she said quietly. "And maybe you don't see that you're hurting us too." I leaned back. Hurt has a funny way of clarifying things. It teaches you what lines should have never been crossed. She swallowed hard. "Mom, we made mistakes. We trusted the wrong people. We let things get messy. But this is destroying everything." I reached across the table, resting my hand over hers. "Destroying everything would be letting you go on, pretending nothing happened." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't even know who we are anymore." I squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe it's time you find out." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked softly on the wall, marking a silence that felt almost tender. When she finally stood to leave, she whispered, "I just want us to be okay." "We will be," I said, "but not by pretending." After she left, I sat there for a while, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. She was still the one with the softest heart. Still the child who had cried when her goldfish died. Still the one who called me when she couldn't sleep. Somewhere in her, there was still goodness. I just hoped it wasn't buried too deep to save. That evening, Linda called with an update. The forensic audit was underway. The independent firm had already found discrepancies in 2 major contracts. She said the evidence was mounting fast, and she expected the board would intervene before the 30 days were up. "They're going to turn on each other," she said quietly. "It's only a matter of time." I didn't answer. I just looked out the window at the dark sky and the reflection of my own face staring back. Somewhere between pride and regret. I wasn't sure which side I belonged on anymore. Friday morning brought another visitor. It was Mark. Standing awkwardly on my porch with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked tired. Older than the last time I'd seen him. "Eleanor. Can we talk?" he said. I nodded and stepped aside. He followed me into the living room, where sunlight spilled weakly through the curtains. He stayed standing, shifting his weight like a man, trying to decide which side of a sinking ship to stand on. "Maggie doesn't know I'm here," he said finally. I figured as much. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Things are getting bad. Eleanor. She's not sleeping. She's terrified the board's going to force her out. She should be more terrified of what she's done than what might happen," I said. He sighed. "I know. Believe me. I do. But she's convinced you're doing this to make a point. Not to fix anything." I looked at him sharply. "And what do you think?" He hesitated, then said, "I think you're right to act. But I also think you don't realize how far she's fallen into this. The company became everything to her after Robert died. It's like she's been chasing his approval all over again." His words landed heavier than I expected. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd seen arrogance, ambición, control, but maybe beneath all that there was still a girl trying to prove something to a father who wasn't here anymore. Mark reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She'll kill me if she finds out I showed you this," he said. "It's from her desk." I unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, dated 2 months earlier. It wasn't long. Just a reminder to herself. Secure expansion funding at any cost. Don't disappoint Dad. Don't fail again. I stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. It didn't look like the confident woman who ran meetings with a smile that could cut glass. It looked like someone barely holding herself together. Mark cleared his throat. "She doesn't even realize how far she's gone. Eleanor. She thinks if she can just hold it all together, everything will make sense again." I folded the note and handed it back. "I can't fix her, Mark. I can only stop her from taking me down with her." He nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that." When he left, the house felt even quieter than usual. I went upstairs, to the room Robert and I had once shared, and opened the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were things I hadn't looked at in years. His cufflinks, his college ring, a stack of letters tied with ribbon. I untied them and read the top one. Dated our 25th anniversary. His handwriting was neat and certain, as it always had been. "You have a fire in you, Ellie. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you small." I set the letter down and smiled sadly. Maybe I was keeping that promise now, even if it didn't feel like victory. That night, I dreamed of the office on Monroe Street, the old warehouse we'd turned into our first headquarters. In the dream, Robert was there, painting the walls, laughing when I told him the color was too bright. Maggie was a child again, handing him the brush. I woke up before the paint dried. Saturday came cold and windy. The trees in the backyard bent under the weight of it. I stayed by the window most of the morning, watching leaves scatter across the lawn. My phone buzzed once. A text from Linda. "Audit nearly done. Finding strong. Prepare for fallout." I typed back one word. "Ready." Then I stood there for a while. Hands clasped. Heart steady. The world outside looked different now. Sharper somehow. I didn't know what the next week would bring. But for the first time in years, I felt sure of who I was again. And maybe that was enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray stillness that always made me uneasy. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts a little too clearly. I made my coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the wind move through the bare trees. The world outside looked cold, brittle, like one wrong word could make it shatter. By mid-morning, Linda called. Her voice carried the tone of someone who had both good news and bad. The audit was complete. The findings were substantial. There was clear evidence of financial misconduct involving all three of my children, though to different degrees. Maggie had approved falsified vendor payments. David had authorized wire transfers to cover short-term gaps before quarterly reporting. Sarah, surprisingly, had benefited indirectly through expense reimbursements that didn't belong to her department. It wasn't one big act of theft. It was a slow bleed of ethics. Drip by drip. Linda said the auditors had already briefed the board. There would be an emergency session within 48 hours to decide on corrective action. I asked her how bad it was going to get. She paused before answering. Bad enough to end careers. Maybe worse if they don't cooperate. I thanked her for her honesty and hung up. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and let the weight of it settle over me. I thought I was prepared for this. I thought I was ready to see my children face the consequences of their choices. But it still hit like a punch to the chest. There's a part of a mother that never stops wanting to protect her children. Even when they're wrong. Maybe especially when they're wrong. That afternoon, the phone rang again. It was Maggie. I almost didn't answer. But something in me said I should. Her voice sounded different this time. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Mom. I know about the audit. I didn't say anything. She took a breath. They called me into the board meeting tomorrow. David too. They're talking about removing us. I kept my voice steady. Then I guess it's time to tell the truth. She let out a sharp, shaky laugh. The truth won't save us now. It might, I said. It always does, eventually. There was a long pause before she whispered. You really did it. You really went through with all of it. I did what I had to do, I said softly. Her voice broke then. Small and raw. You've destroyed our lives. No. Maggie. I just stopped pretending everything was fine. You did the rest. The line went quiet for a long time before she hung up. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. Outside. The wind rattled the window panes like fingers knocking. The next day felt like walking through fog. I didn't go to the board meeting. That wasn't my place anymore. But Linda called me afterward to relay what happened. Maggie had tried to defend herself, claiming the financial moves were temporary. Creative accounting to keep the company afloat. David had supported her, saying everyone in the industry did it. The board hadn't been impressed. They voted unanimously to remove both from their executive roles pending further review. Sarah wasn't fired, but she was suspended while the accounting discrepancies tied to her department were examined. Linda said Maggie left the meeting without saying a word. David stormed out swearing, and Sarah cried quietly the entire time. When I hung up, the house felt colder than it had in months. That evening, I built a fire in the living room, something I hadn't done since Robert died. The smell of the wood and the sound of the crackling flames brought him back to me in a way that hurt and comforted all at once. I sat on the couch with a blanket over my knees and stared into the fire until my eyes blurred. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't even relief. It was something heavier. A deep, hollow ache. This was the part no one ever tells you about doing the right thing, how lonely it can feel. Around 9. Headlights swept across the front of the house. A car door slammed. A few seconds later, someone knocked on the door. Not hard. Not demanding. Just tentative. I knew that knock. I opened the door to find David standing there. Hands stuffed in his pockets. Hair windblown. He looked older than he had a week ago. His voice was quiet. Can I come in? I nodded and stepped aside. He followed me to the living room and stood near the fire, staring at it like he couldn't find the right words. Finally, he said, they took everything. Mom, my title, my shares, my reputation. I took a slow breath. They took what you lost yourself. He winced, then sat down heavily in the armchair across from me. You don't get it. I was trying to keep the company alive. We were all just doing what we thought Dad would want. I turned to him, my voice calm but firm. Your father built that company on integrity, not illusion. He would rather have lost every dollar than cheat a single client. David's eyes shone, and for a second, he looked like a little boy again, caught lying about breaking something fragile. We were desperate, he said softly. Maggie was scared of losing it all. I was just trying to help. I leaned forward. Help isn't lying. Help isn't stealing. Help isn't burying what's wrong to look successful. He covered his face with his hands. I don't know what to do now. Start by taking responsibility, I said, then rebuild something better. He nodded slowly, still staring into the fire. The flickering light made him look younger again. And I wondered if somewhere deep down, this was the moment he might finally grow up. When he left later that night, he paused at the door. I never meant for it to get this bad, he said. I know, I said, but good intentions don't erase bad choices. After he was gone, I stood for a while on the porch, watching the taillights fade down the street. The night air was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs. Above me, the sky stretched wide and empty. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail from the law firm representing the board. Inside was a formal notice of resolution. The company had been placed under interim management, pending legal proceedings. They thanked me for my cooperation and integrity in protecting the property's interests. The words were polite, impersonal, clinical, but they also meant closure. I placed the letter on the kitchen counter and poured myself another cup of coffee. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the steam rising from the mug. For years, I'd wondered what it would feel like to stand on the other side of everything, to no longer be the caretaker, the fixer, the peacekeeper. Now I knew. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and quiet. Not freedom. Exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of it. I looked at the clock. It was almost 10. I picked up the phone and called Linda to thank her for everything. She said she'd drop by tomorrow with the final paperwork and maybe a bottle of wine. I told her that sounded perfect. When I hung up, I stood in the doorway of the living room, watching the ashes in the fireplace glow faintly under the morning light. They looked like the remnants of something that had burned completely, leaving behind only what was essential. And maybe that was all that was left now. What was essential? The next day felt lighter somehow. Like the air in the house had shifted overnight. The sun came through the kitchen window, warm and gold, turning the steam from my coffee into a small, glowing cloud. For the first time in months, there was no weight sitting on my chest. No waiting for the next call. No dread of what might come. Just quiet. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that. Linda arrived just after noon. True to her word. She carried a leather folder in one hand and a bottle of Chardonnay in the other. I opened the door before she could knock, and she smiled in that knowing way of hers. She looked like she'd been awake since dawn. The kind of exhaustion only lawyers and mothers know. She set the folder on the table and poured 2 glasses of wine. The paperwork inside was final. The lease termination had been executed, the company's accounts frozen, and my legal responsibility officially concluded. The board had initiated proceedings to restructure under new leadership. My property, my name, and my reputation were intact. Clean. I signed the last few forms, the pen gliding easily across the paper. When I finished, Linda reached over and turned the last page toward me. One final signature, she said. I added it without hesitation. It felt like closing a door that had been stuck open for too long. When it was done, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled. Congratulations, Eleanor. You survived the storm. I smiled faintly. Surviving isn't the same as winning. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. No. But it's better than sinking. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It reminded me of the nights Robert and I used to share after long work days. The quiet victories no one else ever saw. When Linda finally left, she hugged me tighter than usual. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "I always do," I told her. After she drove away, I walked through the house, letting the silence settle again. I passed Robert's study, still filled with the smell of old paper and cedar polish. The afternoon light fell across his framed degrees, his favorite fountain pen still sitting on the desk. I touched it gently, tracing the worn metal clip with my thumb. I wished he could have seen this day. Not for the victory, but for the clarity. He had always believed truth would rise to the surface eventually. He was right. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I made myself a small dinner, something simple, and turned on the radio for company. The classical station played Debussy, the kind of music Robert used to hum when he cooked. For a few minutes, I just stood in the kitchen, eyes closed, letting it fill the empty spaces inside me. Then, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but the number was familiar. Maggie. My stomach tightened, but I picked up. Her voice was soft, strained. "Mom, can we talk?" I hesitated, then said yes. She arrived an hour later, still in her work clothes, though there was no work left for her now. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and her posture collapsed. I led her into the living room. She sat on the couch and folded her hands in her lap like a child waiting for punishment. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "I lost everything." I sat across from her, keeping my tone even. "You lost what wasn't yours to keep that way." Her chin trembled. "They're saying we could face charges. Do you know what that means for us? For my kids?" I nodded slowly. "I know exactly what it means." Her eyes flashed with anger for a second. "Are you happy now?" I didn't raise my voice. "Do I look happy, Maggie?" She looked down, ashamed. "No. You look tired." "I am," I said. "Tired of watching you forget who you are." She wiped at her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought if I could just keep the company running, keep everyone paid, it would work itself out. That's how every bad decision starts," I said. "With good intentions and no boundaries." She nodded, silent tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't know how to stop. She whispered, "After Dad died, I thought keeping the business alive was the only way to keep him alive too." That one landed deep. I took a slow breath before speaking. "Keeping something alive isn't the same as refusing to let go." She nodded again, shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. For what I said, for what I did." I leaned forward and reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "I forgave you the day I sent that first notice," I said quietly. "I just needed you to see what forgiveness costs." We sat there for a while, holding hands in silence. Outside, the sky had gone pale and gold, the light softening through the curtains. It was strange, but I felt no anger left in me, only a deep, weary relief. Eventually, she stood. "I don't know what's next," she said. "You'll figure it out." I told her, "But this time, you'll do it the right way." She managed a small, shaky smile. "I hope so." After she left, I stood at the window, watching her car disappear down the street. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like chasing after her. She had to find her own way now. Later that evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, I went upstairs and opened Robert's closet. The scent of cedar was still strong, the faintest trace of his cologne still clinging to his old suits. On the top shelf sat a small wooden box I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a letter in his handwriting, one I'd never opened. The envelope was marked only with my name. My hands shook as I unfolded it. My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, it means time has caught up to us. I know you'll face hard choices after I'm gone. You've always had a strength you don't see in yourself. Trust it. Don't let love blind you to truth. And don't let guilt chain you to people who've stopped respecting what's right. The world will always tell you forgiveness is about letting others off the hook. But sometimes, forgiveness is just freeing yourself to move forward. Love. Robert. I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter through tears that blurred the ink. He had known. Somehow. He had known exactly what I would face. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. The sound of wind whispering against the window. That night, I dreamed of standing on a beach with Robert. The waves curling at our feet. The horizon stretched wide and endless. He looked at me and smiled. "You did the hard thing," he said. "That's the right thing." When I woke up, I wasn't crying. I was smiling. The morning light touched the walls, soft and golden. Outside, the world looked clean again. For the first time in years, I felt ready to live for myself, not for the ghosts of who I used to be. The days that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No lawyers calling. No messages from the bank. No anxious waiting for the next confrontation. The world around me felt still, like the house itself was exhaling after months of holding its breath. I spent mornings tending the small garden behind the porch, pruning roses that had grown wild while I was too distracted to care for them. The cold air carried the smell of earth and new beginnings. And I found comfort in that simple rhythm. By the end of the week, I started sorting through boxes I hadn't touched since Robert died. There were old photographs, business records, even the first company ledger we'd kept by hand. I ran my fingers over the faded ink, remembering the nights we used to sit at that same kitchen table, arguing over budgets and laughing when we were both wrong. It felt strange, seeing my life organized in paper and dust. Strange, but good, like proof that everything we had built had really happened. One afternoon, while I was sorting through a box of old legal files, I found an envelope marked retirement planning. Inside was a letter from Robert's accountant from years ago, attached to a form I'd forgotten we'd signed together. It outlined a small investment account we'd opened back in 2005, a safety cushion we'd never used. The account was still active. My name was the sole beneficiary now. When I called the bank to check the balance, I nearly dropped the phone. The account had grown significantly, untouched and quietly compounding for almost 2 decades. I could almost hear Robert's voice saying, "Just in case. Ellie, you always plan for everyone else. Plan something for yourself, too." That night, I sat by the fire and thought about what to do with it. For so long, my life had revolved around saving, protecting, repairing. Maybe it was time to start creating again. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. A few days later, I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "I was wondering if you'd like to have lunch this week. Just us." There was a pause before she answered. "I'd love that." We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place we used to go when she was in college. She looked better, calmer, though the weight of everything that had happened still sat in her eyes. We talked about little things at first. The weather, a book she was reading, her new apartment. Eventually, she reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry for all of it," she said quietly. "For not saying something sooner. For pretending things were fine when they weren't. I squeezed her hand gently. The important thing is you're saying it now. She nodded, eyes glistening. I'm working again. You know, freelance design work. It's not much. But it's honest. I smiled. That's more than enough. When we finished lunch, she walked me to my car. The wind was cold, but the sun was bright. And for the first time in months, I saw a hint of light in her again. As I hugged her goodbye, I whispered, I'm proud of you. She smiled through tears and said, I'm trying to be someone you can be proud of. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to the estate of Robert Morgan. My heart skipped for a moment as I opened it. Inside was a note from Janet, the former accountant at Hartman Interiors. She had been part of the cleanup after the audit, helping the board close accounts and reconcile the company's finances. She'd found an old subsidiary Robert had opened decades earlier, a consulting branch that had gone dormant when the main company expanded. There was still money in it, a modest sum. But what caught my attention was the last line of her note. Your husband designated the funds for an educational trust. It appears he wanted it to go towards something meaningful. I sat with that for a while, the words rolling around in my head. Something meaningful. 2 weeks later, I walked into the local community center and asked to speak with the director. Her name was Denise, a sharp woman in her 50s with kind eyes. I told her I wanted to set up a small scholarship fund for women returning to school later in life, especially those who had left their careers to raise families or care for others. She listened quietly, then smiled and said, we could do something beautiful with that. We spent the next few hours going over paperwork and ideas, and by the time I left, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't about fixing the past anymore. It was about planting something new in the soil of what had already grown. That evening, I called Linda to tell her about it. She laughed softly. That sounds exactly like something Robert would have loved. I think so too, I said. After dinner, I sat in my study with a cup of tea and watched the last light fade from the sky. The world outside my window looked different now. Not softer. Exactly. But steadier. I realized that life after chaos doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly, like dawn slipping through a half-open curtain. A week later, I received a call from Maggie. She had been working with a financial consultant to rebuild her career. Her voice sounded steadier than it had in months. Mom, I wanted to tell you, I'm starting over. Smaller projects this time. Honest ones. I smiled, relief catching in my throat. I'm glad to hear that, Maggie. There was a long pause before she added, I know we can't go back, but maybe we can start new. We can, I said, one step at a time. After we hung up, I went out to the porch. The evening air was crisp and smelled faintly of rain. I looked up at the sky, a soft wash of blue fading to violet, and for a moment, I felt Robert's presence beside me again, not as a memory, but as something steady and quiet inside me. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of lilacs from the neighbor's yard. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. Sometimes, healing doesn't look like forgiveness. It looks like peace after the fire, like a house rebuilt with stronger walls and open windows. It looks like choosing to live again, not because you must, but because you finally can. I went back inside and turned off the lights. The house, for once, didn't feel empty. It felt full. I woke the next morning to the kind of bright winter light that makes the world look scrubbed clean. The porch was rimed with frost, and the bird bath wore a thin lid of ice. I brewed coffee and stood by the window with my hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. The house felt settled, like it had finally found its proper weight on the earth. I had, too. By mid-morning, my calendar buzzed with a reminder I had set weeks earlier. Meet with Denise at the community center. Finalize curriculum notes. I smiled at the thought of it. The Morgan Renewal Grant had grown from a tidy endowment into something larger. A program with workshops and mentorship. A small network of women who showed up for one another with resumes, rides, and casseroles. It was messier than a neat scholarship brochure. And for that reason it felt alive. On my way out the door, I grabbed the navy scarf Robert always liked. The cold bit my cheeks when I stepped outside. But the sky was a clear blue that meant the day intended to be kind. The drive down Lake Shore felt familiar again. Not an errand run by a caretaker, but a small trip taken by someone who gets to choose how she spends her time. The center buzzed with weekday noise when I arrived. In one room, a group practiced interview answers. In another, a volunteer sorted donated laptops. Denise waved me into her office, where a stack of printouts waited. We went over the lesson plan for the new cohort. I suggested adding a session on boundaries at work, the sort of class I wished my younger self had taken. She grinned and wrote it down. "You know you could teach this yourself," she said. "I will," I said. I was just waiting to be asked. We shared a laugh, and then she gave me a look that said she had saved something for last. "There is one more thing," she said. "A donor offered to fund a permanent space. If you are willing, we want to name it the Morgan House for Business Ethics and Leadership." She said the full title slowly, like tasting it. For a moment I could not speak. Robert would have teased that the name was too long. Then, he would have kissed my hand and told me to say yes. I nodded and felt a pull in my chest that hurt and healed at the same time. "Yes," I said, "but only if the doors are always open to anyone who needs them." On my way out of the building, my phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. "Are you home this afternoon?" I typed back that I would be after 2. She replied with a simple, "Thank you." No flourish. No urgency. It felt like progress. At home, I set water to boil for tea and straightened the living room. The late sun angled across the rug in long bars of gold. A few minutes after 2, a car door closed outside and Maggie walked in. Her shoulders squared but not defensive. She carried a paper folder and a nervous sort of hope. She sat and opened the folder on the coffee table. Inside were design mock-ups and a short proposal. "Small business ethics training in partnership with the Morgan House," she said. "I want to do something that helps owners who never get invited into boardrooms. Real tools for real people. Plumbing companies, bakeries, thrift stores. Nothing glamorous. Just honest work." I studied the pages. The ideas were practical and humble. She had built something I recognized. Not because it was trendy, but because it was useful. I looked up at her. "This is good," I said. "Really good." She exhaled like she had been holding her breath for days. "I want to help fix what I broke," she said. "I know I cannot undo it, but I can build something better where I am standing now." I reached across and touched her hand. That is all any of us can do. Build from where we stand. We talked for an hour. Not about what had been taken, but about what could be given. By the end, we had a plan to pilot the workshops at the community center, to bring in Linda for a session on contracts, to ask Sarah to brand the materials. Maggie closed the folder and smiled. This time, without the brittle edges. For the first time in a long time, I saw not the executive she had tried to perform, but the girl who used to sit at my desk with a pencil behind her ear. Later that week, David came by with a box of old files he had found while cleaning out a storage unit. He set the box on the dining table and said he wanted my advice on a project. He had been approached by a nonprofit to modernize their inventory system. Nothing flashy. Just necessary work. He laughed a little and said it felt good to be useful without needing to be important. I told him that feeling never goes out of style. We spent the afternoon sorting files and found, tucked between old insurance forms, A photo of the 5 of us at the Monroe Street warehouse. Robert stood behind us with paint on his shirt. I held a roller. The kids wore matching t-shirts we had made for fun. The picture looked like a relic and a promise. David slid it into his coat pocket and said he would frame it for his apartment. Sarah stopped by the next day with a rough draft of the new website for the Morgan house. Her design was clean and warm, full of faces and stories instead of stock photos. She asked if we could include a page for anonymous questions. A place for people to ask what they were scared to say out loud. I told her that might be the most important page of all. The dedication day arrived with rain in the forecast. The soft kind that makes the city smell like concrete and lilacs. The room was full but not crowded. Friends. A few reporters. Women from the program. A handful of small business owners in their Sunday best. Frank Lewis came with a cane and a tie that looked like it had been ironed twice. Linda stood near the podium, notes in hand. Maggie and David and Sarah sat together in the second row. When Denise asked me to speak, I kept it short. I said that the Morgan house would be a place where truth and kindness share a table. Where the right thing is not something you say to a camera, but something you practice when no one is watching. Where people who have been told to sit down are taught how to stand up again. I thanked the donors. I thanked the staff. I thanked the women who had trusted us with their stories. I thanked Robert. Out loud and in my heart. After the applause, we walked into the hallway, where a small brass plaque waited next to the door. It read, "The Morgan House for Business, Ethics, and Leadership." In honor of Robert and Eleanor Morgan, who believed that dignity is a form of wealth. I ran my fingers over the letters and felt them steady under my hand. Dignity is a form of wealth. He would have liked that. The rain let up long enough for a few photos on the steps. A reporter asked for a quote. I told her that power is not ownership without conscience. Power is stewardship. She scribbled it down and thanked me. I hoped she kept it for herself, not just her story. Late in the afternoon, after the crowd thinned and the lights were dim, I walked alone through the empty rooms. Desks waited. A whiteboard held a list of names for the next workshop. The air smelled faintly of paint and paper. I stood in the center of the main room and listened to the quiet the way you listen to a seashell. For the echo of something larger than the room itself. It sounded like possibility. Back at home, twilight fell in a soft blue curtain. I poured tea and took it to the porch. The yard glistened from the late rain. Somewhere, a neighbor's radio drifted across the fence with a Motown song Robert used to hum off-key. The ache I carried for him did not leave. But it had changed temperature. It had become a companion rather than a wound. Headlights swept across the driveway and a car door closed. Maggie walked up the path with cautious steps. She sat beside me without a word. For a while we just listened to the wet branches creak. Then she said it in a small, steady voice. You did not pretend to be important. Mom, you were. I felt the truth of it land between us. Simple and heavy as an apple on a table. I did not answer. I did not need to. We sat there until the air turned crisp enough to drive us inside. That night, before bed, I opened the cedar box and took out Robert's letter. I read it again, then folded it carefully and placed it under the ribbon. I whispered a thank you into the dark room. Not because I believed he was listening from somewhere, but because gratitude needs somewhere to go. I turned off the light and let the house settle around me. The quiet felt earned. In the morning, I woke before the alarm and watched the light move across the ceiling like water. I thought about the women who would step through the doors of the Morgan house. About the men, too. About anyone who needed a place to learn how to do work with clean hands and a clear head. I thought about my children. Not as characters in a battle, but as human beings making another try at being good. I thought about my younger self. The one who painted warehouse walls and believed that hard things could be done. I got up and made coffee. The day waited. Modest and generous. So did I. If you have ever been told to sit down and be quiet, If you have been underestimated, overlooked, or spoken over, I would like to hear your story. Share it. Stay with me for the next one. And if this journey meant something to you, let me know. Your voice matters here. And it might be the spark someone else needs to stand up.